Dr. Balescu, Dr. Blavis, Dr. Adhikari, thank you for coming. Good morning.
Hey,
Good
thank you
morning.
for the invite. Appreciate it.
Of course.
Thanks for
Good
Good to
morning.
see
organizing.
everyone.
Likewise. Thank
I, of course, would be remiss if I didn't mention before we started Dr. Rapolo and Dr. Ferry and all the work that they've done in putting this together. I know that you guys have been receiving a lot of emails from me and from those two, but really could not have begun to have participated in the organization of this without their help.
Yeah, we got to thank Kevin, my administrative assistant, for being the magic too. But thank you everybody for coming.
And of course to Kevin. Thank you, Kevin. So it is 12:01 and I want to kick things off and get us started. Thank you to everybody for coming. My name is Ryan Bellinger. I am currently the Clinical Ultrasound Fellow at John Peter Smith Health Network in Fort Worth, Texas, and Assistant Professor of Medicine at Texas Christian University School of Medicine. Thank you again to everyone. This is the first part of ACEP's Emergency Ultrasound Research Subcommittee and AI and Emerging Technology Subcommittee AI Essentials webinar. Today's focus is going to be on research and development of artificial intelligence in emergency and point of care ultrasound. I want to mention before we start that, again, this is a three-part webinar and that we'll have part 2 of this series on March 18th with the time yet to be determined. That session will be focused on AI implementation in ultrasound. We have an extremely talented and accomplished group of panelists here today who have volunteered their time to be here and talk about artificial intelligence in point of care ultrasound. Dr. Rapolo is going to put their full bios in relation to this webinar in the chat, but I want to give each of the panelists a brief opportunity to introduce themselves, what their involvement in artificial intelligence and artificial intelligence research is, and in alphabetical order, if we can start with Dr. Srikar Adhikari.
Well, thank you. My name is Srikar Adhikari. I'm one of the faculty in the Emergency Medicine Department in Tucson, University of Arizona. I've been involved with POCUS for a long time, trained under Mike Blavis. I have been doing ML related research, using ultrasound data for the past 4 or 5 years. Fortunate to get some federal funding. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Dr. Balescu, would you like to go next?
Sure. I feel like it feels very school. I'm an assistant professor of emergency medicine. I work at Yale. I worked on some projects related to the development and validation of artificial intelligence algorithms for lung ultrasound as well as some cardiac ultrasound, both for pathology detection and sort of quantification, mostly B-line detection, but then also AI guidance for acquisition of lung ultrasound. And some of these have been in through collaboration with industry.
Thank you very much. Dr. Blavis.
Thank you. My name is Mike Blavis. I've been doing point of care ultrasound since about 1993, focusing on AI in the last 11 years or so, and kind of have two different tracks: the academic, which is research, education, and AI. We've got about 20 manuscripts plus out in the last 10 years, and that's mostly dealing with imaging and AI and different pitfalls of it, et cetera. And then quite a bit on the commercial side as well, working with vendors. I've had several fractional chief medical officer positions with companies that did handheld ultrasound and AI and some with robotics. So have kind of shepherded a number of products through FDA pathways, the EU as well, Health Canada, and still do a lot of research in our lab here on the academic side. And sorry, my academic appointment's University of South Carolina as professor of medicine affiliate, but I actually live completely on the other side of the country. Thank you for having me.
Thank you very much. Dr. Duggan.
Thanks, Ryan. So I'm Nicole Duggan. I'm faculty in the Emergency Medicine Department at Brigham and Women's in Boston, along with, East Coast, many of you. My academic focus is actually on data, and so I'm interested in development of data sets, development of gold standards for ultrasound data, and understanding how we can use the data that's available to create some of the tools that all of you have been working with, and to develop and validate some of the, upcoming POCUS-based AI tools. Um, it's it's definitely very nitpicky work and very detail-oriented work, but I think getting, great data sets and it is important to understanding the research that's out there and the products that we can use in our daily clinical work.
Thank you very much. Dr. Pari?
Thank you. My name is Joe Perry. I am associate professor at Brown. My area of expertise or focus has been on AI development for thoracic ultrasound imaging as well, either B-lines or pleural fluid analysis. My partners have mostly been at other academic institutions as opposed to industry. And then I also have done some other image analysis beyond just ultrasound, looking at hyperspectral imaging, and that partnership has been with the NIH. And thanks for having me.
Thank you for being here. And finally, Dr. Schnittke.
My name is Nikolai Schnetke. I am faculty in emergency medicine at OHSU in Oregon, and the fellowship director here for ultrasound. I started getting involved kind of accidentally in machine learning development. My main focus has been on the FAST exam, but the kind of the grant mechanism and industry partnership has led me to a lot of lung ultrasound, and kind of infectious disease and pneumonia and the RDSE type of work, some of which we've done with Christiana through BARDA.
Thank you, Dr. Schnittke. I also want to thank, before we get started, Dr. Lynn Rapolo and Dr. Rob Ferry again for helping to coordinate and promote this webinar, and to ACEP for sponsoring the event. We have some basic topics that we've outlined that we want to cover during this webinar today, but I encourage any of our attendees to ask questions as they come up, to put them in the chat, either the general chat or to me privately, and I'm happy to ask our panelists any of those questions. So most of us have seen artificial intelligence features begin to emerge either in practice or promotion of commercial ultrasound products. In fact, just a couple weeks ago, my institution had multiple ultrasound vendors showing some of their new cart-based devices and features, and many of them were promoting some basic AI features on the machines, like automated calculation of ejection fraction, identification of specific nerves for regional anesthesia, or AI coaching for window optimization. These are exciting potential applications, but like anything that we do in our clinical practice, it's important for us to understand, at least to a basic degree, how these applications are built, what are their strengths and what are their limitations. The vast majority of these applications are predictive models, meaning they're trained to receive a certain input, in these cases, a clip or an image, and provide an output in response, such as a measurement or identification of a structure. The ability of these artificial intelligences to predict or provide a response depends heavily on the quantity and the quality of the data points that they are given in their development. And I'd like to begin by asking our panel of researchers to tell us a little bit about the types of data sets that are used in building these models, and a surface level explanation of how these models and data sets are constructed.
Who wants to take this, guys?
You can go if you want, Nicole. We can add
Yeah.
on.
I'll just start, and then I think everybody who has a little bit of a diversified experience in industry and can weigh in as well, because the ways that you collect data are a lot different between kind of academia and industry. So ultrasound has a lot of research out there. There are a lot of data sets that are collected. A lot of them are fairly variable, though, is the problem. And so they're either a somewhat small data set, or they're variable in the ways they're collected, or the types of ways they're validated. And so also gold standard is an issue in ultrasound too, right? So for some findings, we can use like things like CT or MRI to kind of give us the optimal gold standard for a finding that we're trying to create models. If you're looking for like, you know, diagnostic AI tools. But for things like B lines, for example, there's not necessarily a clear gold standard, and there's a lot of inter-rater variability in terms of what constitutes a beeline, or, an ultrasound interpretation. And so understanding how the data is collected and how it's validated and how it's scored when you're thinking about an AI model, or what is informing that model, is super critical. And so there are efforts to harmonize data across different data sets, like both nationally and worldwide. And those are just kind of in their infant stages. But that is one of, I think, the most important starting points when thinking about whether an AI tool that we see either from industry or whether we're thinking about using in our EDs is something that is actually going to give us the data, the information that it claims to be giving, essentially. And so I think that the data is everything when you're thinking about AI tools and development.
I can go next. I guess the way that I think of this is in buckets. You could have maybe like a retrospective ultrasound data set. That's some stuff that you usually pull from the middleware or the POCUS manager. Loops, stills, sort of depending on sort of the type of algorithm you're trying to build and sort of what the data that feeds into is. And then, the pros of something like that would be usually there's like a larger volume of clips that are available because you don't have to painstakingly acquire each one. There's some real world variability in there, but they often are messier in quality, and sometimes you have to do sort of a lot of quality management. And as a sort of the opposite of that is more prospective data set, which you can standardize a little bit in sort of the views that you get, depending on sort of your planned labels. You can have like a more protocolized acquisition if you want them all to be same depths and gain, things like that. And then the other bucket or the other sort of set that I think about is the annotation piece. And that's, are you going to have a data set that's expert annotated? Are you going to have a data set where your labels or sort of your ground truth comes from a report in the chart, or a reference standard similar to what Nicole was talking about? Like, is it an MRI or a CT or a chest X-ray or something like that? That's my sort of big level data framework, I guess.
Yeah, I agree with all of that. I think there's also kind of different burdens of proof on your algorithm depending on what you're actually trying to produce. So to a certain extent, it almost doesn't matter what you use to train your algorithm if as far as like the first version of it. Where it really starts to matter is how you validate that algorithm, right? So like you can scrub the internet, you can scrub POCUS Atlas for a bunch of positive views, or we did that IBC paper and Probing the Literature Journal Club one of the weeks or months. And you can build something because you can almost always kind of fit a model to a data set. But where it really starts to matter is how you validate it. And it becomes really challenging if you have a dirty retrospective data set, it becomes really challenging to say, hey, build this thing based on a bunch of stuff I scrubbed from the internet. Um, and it seems to work on that data set. And so until you can have a prospective data set, it's really challenging to like use anything in clinical practice. And I think about it exactly the same as any other clinical decision rule that you see developed, right? Like whether it's Canadian head CT rule or some Ottawa ankle rule, the data that goes in is important, but really the thing that allows you to use something clinically is the validation study, right? Until something's been externally validated on the patient population on a clean data set, it becomes really challenging to understand how you're going to use them in clinical practice.
I can go next. So I will offer some practical pointers here. So what we have gone through when we are developing the models, I think the first question we asked was, what exactly is the model seeing, and at what granularity is the data should be seen? So is it single frames, or is it like a cine loops or a sequence of images? So that way, when we're compiling the data, we take this into consideration. And then it comes to labeling. Are those image level labels, Are we labeling by pixel and bounding boxes and so on? Or are we labeling at a patient level, right? So those things need to be taken into consideration. And one of the important questions which will come up, every model, I think, is the quality of the images, right? So everybody's asking all the developers, so if you give this, let's say, all the way from some very good images all the way to really images with subtle findings, how do we proceed? So my answer has always been just like we were trained and just like a medical student is trained, because we're not going to show them the subtle findings at the beginning of their training, right? We're going to show them very obvious findings. So that's just like that. We give them clean images to the model. Here's a retinal detachment. That's what we did. We're going to give a very obvious retinal detachment. And then we can escalate to nuances, subtle findings, and so on, so we can increase the complexity. So that's how we've been training, and the models then learn better because they've already seen the very obvious findings, and then now they can go on to learn the little things. And then the real issues, I'll just take one more minute. And the other issues we faced are class imbalance, right? How many retinal detachment we will see if you see 100 patients with the vision symptoms, maybe 10 tops, right? So you have class imbalance. How do you account for those class imbalance? And then can we use any sort of data augmentation techniques for generating any synthetic images, and also any sort of data harmonization? And some of these may help you a bit, but they can never help you to cover up or compensate for the inadequacies of the data. So that bear that in mind. And I think the most important thing is you have to have your data sets organized well. Which one is a training data set? Which one is internal validation? Which one is a test data set? And make sure there are no what we call as a data leakage across the data sets. And those are all important things. And the last thing I want to mention is about spectrum bias, because if you just give them the very obvious findings, then somewhere in between, the model will not be able to recognize. So take into consideration as you are developing the data sets, because we have done the other way. We didn't take into consideration. We got into issues. Then we had to go back and collect the data and all that stuff. So bear that in mind.
Yeah, I think there's also a trade-off, right? And what everybody's alluding to is that there's a trade-off between having like a perfect, beautiful, prospectively collected data set that is just so internally consistent and gorgeous, and that being generalizable to like a general use purpose, right? Like I can have the most beautiful data set, but images in POCUS are not beautiful, right? And so I'm going to need a tool potentially to function in non-perfect scenarios. And so there's this kind of internal conflict between having a really like high functioning algorithm and having something that's super generalizable that I can throw into any clinical scenario and have function. And so you kind of got to weigh, which of those is more important to you, or what balance is the right fit for the tool that you're trying to develop.
So it's interesting. If you plan to take something to market in North America or the EU, you kind of go through a lot of these thought processes. And obviously, if you're going to get something cleared as opposed to doing a DIY approach and just using it at your hospital, you automatically will have to basically complete a pivotal study. So that kind of eliminates a lot of the issues of bias in a way, data leakage that Shrikar brought up, and other things, because the FDA, you'll basically have to set up a Q-sub or a pre-submission meeting, possibly several documents that you submit, where you essentially get permission for the study you want to do. And if you don't, the FDA will just punish you to no end. So you'll essentially have to get agreement from them, their biostatisticians, et cetera, on the data set. And in truth, they actually don't care what data you trained on. Now they do, and occasionally they ask questions, and sometimes they ask to review it. I've never actually seen them ask much about it, other than 30,000 foot level questions, unless you run into trouble with your pivotal study. And now every company's a little bit different. If you're a startup and you have a little bit of funding, you're very tight. If you're a startup, you have more funding. Obviously, you have much more flexibility. But a lot of these concepts start with engineers, sometimes not with medical people. Then they're amended by input from clinicians. The initial data sets for most of these are basically a bunch of engineers between like 22 and 30 sitting around in cubicles. And I've seen a lot of data sets start that way, or they're bought wholesale, often, as Nicole pointed out, from like the leading institution in a country, which brings a whole other dimension of problems. But all of these factors kind of go in, and during the pathway, a lot of times you actually go back and you change your model. Now, 10 years ago, you kind of used AlexNet or VGG16, and that was it. Now you have so many models to choose from, and a lot of what actually goes into your choice is your target audience. How are they going to use it? Is this going to be on the edge computing? If it's on the edge, how big a chip do you have? How fast is it? How much power does it take? Where do you have to stick it? Is it going to be in your transducer wholly contained in that, or in the tablet, et cetera? So there's so many factors that go into this, and that can impact your data set, plus what you're doing with it. It's a really fascinating question, but I can't think. I mean, you almost need a day and all of us together taking an hour to answer it, I think.
There's a lot of great points being made, and I want to touch on a couple different things that have been mentioned in separate questions, one of which being the relationship between the FDA and regulations and things like that with these AI tools. And I want to circle back to that. I want to talk a little bit more about our validation of these data sets and these artificial intelligence tools. And I'm hoping some of our panelists can speak to how do we ensure that these data sets undergo quality ongoing validation once they've been implemented. And I want to talk about how that validation continues in the setting of knowing that we have a dynamic and changing patient population, and we live in the setting of continually improving hardware with continually improving machines and devices that are provided to us from these commercial companies. How do we ensure ongoing validation, and what can we do as researchers to be ensuring that that validation is of a high quality and that these models that have been generated are actually serving the purpose that they've been created to do?
I think that's one of the biggest challenges in general. The FDA is struggling with it a ton within that software as medical device space. I think that there needs to be more of us that really think about what the best practices are for this. Because at the moment, the bar, it's a lot of work. I don't want to diminish any company that has gotten to the point of getting, FDA submission and clearance. And also, it is not sufficient for most of us to just throw it at our learners in a lot of ways, or certainly at a clinical practice. And you layer on top of that the dynamicity of these things that you've described, that like you can continue to improve an algorithm, and it really turns into kind of a mess. And I think we're kind of living it at the moment.
It's the one thing that I'd add to that is that you sort of also have to think of like what you can do or what needs to be done at like the level of, country, state, sort of large level, like across institutions. But then there's also sort of some local quality assurance, like local, I guess governance is really the term that I'm trying to use, that kind of needs to be put in place too, because your, local population will differ from maybe like what the software was trained on and validated on, or if it doesn't, then I guess it's a little bit easier, but things will change over time too. So there's drift and other things to consider. So it's not just the FDA, it's a lot of players, I guess, is what I'm trying to say.
Okay, I had something very smart sounding to contribute, but I don't. So I'll just try to contribute an interesting bit of information. It's very important to also keep in mind what the intended use is, the IFU, et cetera. And let's say company X, who's a hardware vendor, that they put out a new app. It's probably only going to work on the machine it was intended for, because that's what the data sets were trained on. And the FDA is pretty good about making sure of that. One of the classic examples is Caption Health, who's now under different ownership. When they originally came to the FDA, there was a negotiation process that occurred because they said, okay, we're going to be ultrasound system agnostic. And the FDA actually came back and said, okay, please bring us every ultrasound system and make sure that your AI works on it. And there, I wasn't there, but the person that described it to me was, and it was kind of interesting. I'm sure there was a very long pause of like, say what? And it was a gradual negotiation and realization and awakening to pain where they finally said, oh, well, actually, maybe just 4 machines. Well, we'll do 1 machine. And obviously that it's expanded since then, but then now maybe contracted. But you have to keep that in mind because the FDA definitely does. And when you come saying something's agnostic, I think they've changed their views. I can't speak for them. Probably now there's a cutoff, like if you can show 20 different systems. And there are a number of vendors out there, software, that have developed software solutions that'll work on multiple different systems. And my experience has been one of the papers we published, we trained on, I think, 20 or so, 22 different systems because to someone's point, beggars can't be choosers. And we basically rated the internet and pulled videos from everything. But when I tested that in the lab prospectively, actually on some data beyond that paper, interestingly, it ended up being a very robust algorithm where switching to a different machine didn't bother it because all the junky video I trained it on was actually very diverse. So you can reach that point, but I went off the road here, but be very careful about or intentional about what the IFU says, use it on this system in these settings, because the FDA does keep pretty narrow guardrails on these software packages.
Mike, I'll just add to that. The technology will continue to evolve, and then the protocols it will change, right? So the data is going to change. So, I mean, obviously that's referred to as data drift, right? So every time you develop a model, you have to monitor the data drift. So that's just going to happen for sure. But I feel like it's the same thing like anything else we do in life. We need to make quality assurance, right? Feedback from the users, governance, right? These are the 3 main things. That's how we monitor these things. And it's no different for POCUS either, for POCUS AI models, I should say. But I do want to add one thing, which is important. I think this data drift is also very good because the models do get better. Mike and myself, we were at a meeting in January about why Tesla's self-driving software is much better now than it has been, 5 years ago, because it's adaptive learning, right? It's constantly looking at the new situations. And as models look at the new data, they're adaptive, they're learning. So Mike, if I'm right, it's a PCCP, I think, right? That's the mechanism which allows, if you develop a model, it is learning from the new data, then the FDA allows you right now to go back within certain limits that you can actually don't need to go through again the same whole process again. You can actually change your model based on the new data you have seen if it is getting better. I think it is PCCP. So there's advantage to seeing new data as well. So.
Thank you, everybody. I want to touch on a little bit just on the collection of data, and how we ensure the quality of that data to build data sets and algorithms. There's been some discussion about a couple different things, and institutional collection of stills and clips versus talking about pulling some of these clips and stills from the internet in order to build algorithms and teach things. And I'm wondering if the panelists here can talk a little bit about what their thoughts are in terms of building this from an institutional perspective, where everything and all of the data comes from an internal source where you can ensure the quality and what machines everything is collected on, versus pulling a large amount of clips from the internet, and kind of what the limitations are in terms of different ways of collecting and building the data sets. And if you have any frameworks, or if there's sort of a gold standard guideline for building these data sets out there, and maybe speak to what frameworks exist for building those data sets.
So what I would say is, like, in my opinion, maybe other people have other thoughts about it too, is there's two primary different data sets that you're going to have or be working with potentially. One would be a like unsupervised learning data set where you might pull a bunch of images with associated maybe reports. And then you're just going to give that to your algorithm to try and like pull data from the report to be able to train your algorithm. The other data set that might be a little bit more higher quality, but is much more expensive and time intensive would be to go through and label all of the images directly, and have more of a supervised learning approach to your algorithm development. And for reference for those people who haven't been involved with it, usually you're going to require like 50,000 images or more, usually, even high quality ones potentially, sometimes depending on what you're looking at to be able to create a really good algorithm. I don't know if people have worked with lower or higher. I think Mike talked about labeling quite a few images several years ago. But those are the two different ones, and they have both benefits as well as drawbacks. And regardless of what data set you use, there's going to be variability, usually unless it's prospectively collected, in how those images were acquired, the quality of them, who like actually acquired them as well. In addition to like machine presets, which are really difficult to deal with when you're dealing with thousands and thousands and thousands of images.
Dr. Duggan, do you want
Best
to
I
speak to
can.
those labeling cheats that you mentioned in the chat?
Oh, I mean, I agree completely with Joe. There are pros and cons to both of these types of data, but if you are trying to go for a supervised set, there are cheats out there. So like things like crowdsourcing, you can actually have AI label your your data sets, right? So there are like cheaper alternatives that are variably effective. Again, it just depends on really how robust of a supervised set you need. Um, we've all, I'm sure, been there where we've been sitting there manually labeling 1,000 whatever beelines, like whatever, for hours and hours and hours, right? It's kind of a rite of passage. I don't know that that's the most effective use of time or approach, but there are lots of alternatives to how data can get labeled.
Uh, what I think about the data collection of the data, it seems like, Ryan, that's your collect. If when somebody wants to get involved with the AI project, how can they collect the data, right? So ideally, what we should do, which is just not possible, is like 5 different vendors, different machines in our ED, which we do buy. We do have them, and then create a prospective protocol that everybody is adherent to. They follow the same protocol, right? This is what, when you do the vendor sponsored studies, like Philips comes to you and asks you to collect images, they give you the protocol, R1, R2, R3, this is the way you need to collect, because they know then they get their required set of images. So that's just not possible, right? So then we have to look at our 15 years of QPath data and then sort them out, which fits into our protocol. That's a reverse way of doing it. So, but internet images, I'm not sure, because I don't think there is any great, I shouldn't say not great, even a good data set out there. You could go like Stanford Echo data set. You can go and get the Echo images, right? They're all like cleaned up, very good images, but they're not going to do anything to our implementing a model in our setting. So we're done with our Ultrasound study. We're going to release our data set for public use. So thousands of images of retinal detachment and all the normal images. So that's the kind of data sets we need in future, I think, for if it comes to internet. But otherwise, I think it's going to be the how tightly you implemented your data collection protocols by residents, attendings. That's what it will come down to, I think.
I think one thing that comes up in like research webinars a lot, not machine learning related, but in general, is getting a statistician involved early. And I think the equivalent for this kind of work is you need to have and trust and have really open communication with your technical team. Because I know there are some people on this call that do some of their own model development. I do not. And I think having talented engineers who understand the technical limitations of what you're capable of doing is critical. And that once you build that kind of connection, you can then say, hey, this is actually the clinical question that I think is a huge problem, right? Like when we started the fast exam stuff, just as a kind of a personal example, there was like the funding, everything was about like, we want a fluid detector so that our medics in the battle zone can like find free fluid and transport these people really quickly. And sure, that's like a cool goal, but I was like, that's not even like half of my problem, right? Like my problem is like nobody's saving their fast images. So how do we build something and put something together where people this thing can save images, right? Um, or do QA and be like, hey man, like you think you have a negative fast, but you showed me nothing other than Morrison's pouch, right? So like, so there's applications that you can start building out, but you need to have your technical folks involved early so that you can think through what's feasible. To Mike's point, like what is going to be reported in real time, because that's a lighter architecture model that might be able to run really quickly, but maybe not necessarily as accurately. And then what hits on accuracy are you willing to take? Because everything has trade-offs, up and down. And so if you can take a hit on accuracy without harming your patient, then that might be okay. On the flip side, you know, this lofty goal of having a free fluid detector in the belly, that has huge implications almost in any environment, right? A mistake there could be like, oh crap, this thing told us we need to go to the OR. Or, hey, this thing told us we're totally fine. And then we like messed around looking for other sources of bleeding for a while. And so a mistake in that space is a lot higher stakes. We'll have a higher bar for clearance for the FDA or for any clinical integration than just something that can save your images. But I think having your engineers involved early is critical so that you can build something that makes sense.
I certainly sympathize with difficulty getting people to save images, and struggling with the human element of research, especially when we're asking, a lot of our clinicians to find time during their shifts to do things that are helpful to us in terms of data collection, and knowing that adherence to protocol, especially when people are working clinically, oftentimes is substandard. Um, have you all found any, I guess, before I move on, because I have some questions about FDA regulations that I really want to give some people here the opportunity to touch on. Anything that you found particularly helpful, just very briefly, in getting people to adhere to any of these data collections when you're utilizing clinicians who are collecting data in real time, in terms of just improving their quality or adherence?
Yeah,
Nicole
Taylor.
says, "Hey, them." Yes, that's certainly helpful.
You got to find the
Or
carrot, man.
some sort of other carrot.
I,
Also,
I
I
think
think
also
just
very clear
having,
priorities.
yeah, and just reminders and things. I think we all drift to sort of what we know and what our default, um, I guess, way of labeling or way of doing ultrasound is, and that may be different than that specific protocol that you're trying to achieve, I guess.
I will say human behavior is the toughest thing to change. We all know that, right? So, but I do think, well, I'll say one thing though. As the image acquisition models are getting sophisticated, now the models are telling this is an optimal image. Well, I'm going to save it. So I think the future looks better in the next few years, even for us to develop a model to detect pulmonary embolism. If not to name any company names, if one company is developing and we're using it for image acquisition, then we expect some degree of uniformity in the collection of the images because it's determining the quality meter, whatever that might be. So I do feel like in the next few years, we will have better images or sort of like images we could use for developing the models much better than where we are right now. So
Are there any potential drawbacks to having algorithms that identify ideal and automatically save real clips, and having sort of a feedback loop where the AI models are saving the clips that are then being taught to teach the AI models?
skill degradation is one of the important topics people have discussed over and over, but it is no different from anything else we are using right now. So nobody has a great answer how we can handle skill degradation. So should we still be using direct laryngoscopy, or should we just go look at the vocal cords and put the tube? So that's a difficult answer. I mean, difficult question to answer. So
I also think that's not a question that's just pertinent to point of care ultrasound. I think that's just AI in general in healthcare. Like I don't think it's not going to be just an us problem.
There is a question, and even already it looks like a response in the chat regarding development of international repository of curated images so that everyone isn't working independently, and a response that the data is out there and it's difficult for us all to access. Does anyone have anything to add?
So yes, that's absolutely a priority. Some of my biggest projects are making open access data sets available. And even I will say, if you get the approvals from these are academic institutions we're talking about, but even if you get the approvals on the front end to do this and the funding and everybody's on board, the door will shut on you at the back end a lot of time when they realize you're sitting on something valuable and potentially like worth, sharing, even if from a patient privacy standpoint, it's rock solid, right? So yes, there is a definite push for data democratization. The other issue you get beyond the sharing is one, sharing internationally right now. So that is a particular challenge at this moment, which is a little bit unique. And two, where do you host the data, right? So these are very potentially, hopefully, large data sets that are very rich with metadata. So who hosts them? Where do you store them? How do you gain access to them, right? Like, is this something that you make as a free-for-all online, or do you have to prove that you had some sort of medical intention for it, right? So, like, it seems like kind of a Goldilocks sort of situation to just have this giant open access data set of all ultrasound that exists in one repository where anybody can access. But there's a lot of stakeholders and there's a lot of people that have competing interests about what you do with that data and how that data is used beyond just the patient safety issue, right? Like you can imagine for something like a complex imaging study, like an MRI, there may be some way to back end find outpatient information identifiers about that, even if there's nothing clearly on the face of the image or in the metadata. With ultrasound, like a beeline, I don't think I'm gonna be able to say like, hey, that's my aunt's beeline, right? But there's still other issues out there that you keep running into. And I will say, you think that you've solved everything, and then the doors just keep slamming shut. So yes, it's a goal, but we're not there yet.
If you get the federal funding, you're required to uh, give out the data to public data set. So we actually have to give the code as well. So it's all in GitHub. So those rules are pretty clear. Then the clinical corporates cannot come and block you to share the data publicly. So that's federal funding. Data sharing is very transparent and it can be done easily. But others, it's pretty much on you how you want to share the data and how your clinical partners will allow you to share the data or not. So,
And one thing I think maybe unintentionally for those like private funded or industry funded work that are creating these data sets that they choose not to share, they may end up developing really helpful AI algorithms, which then may make it difficult for smaller ultrasound vendors to compete in the same space. So I do worry about the long-term effects of data sets, who has access to them, and how that may actually, in the long term, hinder competitiveness in the ultrasound market if we see smaller, newer starter companies having difficulty getting into the space due to like financial restrictions.
Yeah, and a lot of your contract, like when you set up a study, with a lot of industry, is like there's a part about what you can do with the data and what you can't do with the data and sharing and things.
I think we could
Which
probably
not surprisingly is restrictive.
I think we could probably talk for a full hour just about democratization of data and sharing and building these repositories. I do want to touch on another topic while we still have a little bit of time left, and that is FDA approval and classification. And I'm hoping our panelists can speak a little bit about how the FDA specifically classifies and designates these algorithms in medicine, and how these designations apply to our research and our clinical integration. And maybe if we can have folks talk about FDA approval, 510(k) clearance, and what they mean for us as researchers and clinicians.
I feel like that's a Mike question.
I'll try and tackle it. Somebody wave me off if I'm totally off the rails. So most of these are going to go through the ultrasound and mammography branch, but not always. I've had a couple divert to other branches. you're looking at 510K. 510K-C doesn't probably apply for most of us. That's like a small adjustment. The worst is de novo. So we mentioned Caption Health earlier. They had to go de novo because there was no predicate. And that's the idea with the 510K, whether it's a video laryngoscope, like Dr. Adhikari mentioned, or AI software, that you have to be able to tie it to something. Interestingly, that branch has gotten at least less restrictive or less difficult about meeting the predicate exactly. They become more flexible, so the kind of the intent of a prior use can now transfer rather than it has to be very similar, which is nice. And the novel pathway obviously is the toughest. They're going to be very critical. That's 150 days to respond after you submit. 510K is 90. The requirements, the numbers, the burden of proof is going to be higher for de novo than for 510K. Other things to keep in mind: it used to be about 50% of your data had to come from the states, and longer ago it was less and less. There was talk in the hallways with the FDA about that going up to 75. I've not heard that that's been implemented, but do be aware of that for your pivotal study, not for the where you train the data set. So to bring in data to prove your 510K to get it, a good amount of it's going to come from the states, which to most of us is kind of an obvious, but from the industry side, it may not be. I don't know if I've said too much or enough, but I'll go mute.
No, I think that was great. And so it sounds like touching on a detail that even I wasn't aware of, although some of our panelists here probably were, where the data is collected to train the algorithm is not necessarily as important sometimes as where the data is collected to validate the algorithm.
Correct. Because the proof's in the pudding, and that's what they focus on. Now, there are requirements about data similarity. So you're going to have to report why you think the data set you trained on from, I'm just going to pick Hungary. Let's say all the data came from these great hospitals in Hungary and it's hard to get elsewhere. Why does it transfer? What are the demographics like? They'll probably have some flexibility on that. But for the pivotal study, you'll definitely, you might be under more scrutiny than if you said, well, the original 50% came from, Hungary and the EU, but we supplemented with 50% from the USA. And I forgot completely Dr. Adhikari's excellent point about the fact that there is a new pathway that's opened up. And I think the same will start in MDR and EU, which is updating your algorithm following a prescribed recipe. So once you get your 510K or de novo, you can change your algorithm, retrain it, make it better without having to go through 510K again. And that can save companies years and millions.
Mike, I'll add to that. Oh, sorry, Nicola, you want to go?
No, go ahead.
Okay. So I think Mike went through a lot of good stuff. So, but I wanted like core question. I mean, the one question I haven't asked, and I don't know how many of us actually ask ourselves when we were trying to develop a model, how many of us actually make a list like what FDA needs, like eventually, right? So they go by setting, right? Where are you going to use this model? And not only the equipment we talked about, what kind of end users, right? What's the indication? So we never like, at least I shouldn't say we, at least I never thought about those things early on when I'm working on developing the models, but now I'm much more careful. When you're developing a prospective study, is this going to align with the FDA QSUB? So when they ask questions, am I going to be able to answer these questions for this clinical validation study I'm developing? This is the reason I think if you go back and look from COVID time, there are tons of beeline models have been developed. How many of them actually made it through FDA? I can tell you almost none on the academic side. So very like the only validated models are coming from the industry vendors, right? So I think it's important to develop this perspective as we are working on AI models. If the life cycle of that model, if it is going to end up with FDA, and what are the checkboxes I need to make sure it's all taken care of.
Yeah, that's the other people to involve is if you're really trying to make a product is to have a regulatory team is really important. what I was going to say, Mike, you mentioned pivotal studies. My sense from what I've seen in the literature and like my interactions with the FDA, which are very sparse, but I've had a couple, is the standard for 510(k) clearance, if you obviously you need your predicate, is really some form of a reader study, which comes from the radiology kind of standard, right? Like someone gets a CT scan, and you have a bunch of radiologists say if there's a subdural, and then you ask the algorithm if there's a subdural, and that seems to be sufficient to prove safety and efficacy and equivalency, which is kind of the standard of for a 510(k). But when you're dealing with something like B lines or cardiac acquisition or interpretation, the acquisition piece of point of care ultrasound is such a huge portion, that it becomes really challenging, I think, for us on the clinical side, maybe not on the research side because we have to do something, but on the clinical side, knowing who acquired those images is really, really important. And to my understanding, and maybe y'all can correct me, that piece is not a variable that is something the FDA looks at very carefully of like who acquired those images compared to who the target user is.
In the pivotal study, you'll have to declare, and actually, the FDA will be all over you like I don't know what. uh, and it all comes down to claims, and this is what you have to work out with the FDA because let's say you and I make a product that helps cardiac acquisition. Goodness knows we need another one of those. Uh, so let's say we decide to do that, but in our pivotal study, we actually don't have any emergency physicians do the scanning. We only have sonographers, echo techs. Well, the claim we're going to get stuck with is no, this doesn't work for emergency physicians. It works for echo techs. And I've seen where they even play favorites with, I won't name the department or the branch, with specialties. So, well, this will work for neurologists or anesthesiologists, but not for you emergency physicians. Obviously, they didn't say you scumbag emergency physicians, but they said, but not in emergency medicine. And then you can subdivide it further, like, well, nurses and medical students. So you'll have to get that straight in the pivotal study, or it'll burn you on the tail end because it really all about claims, what you can prove, because you can have this great product and intent to change the world, but then on the back end of the FDA, where you kind of get dropped down, you have a claim that is like you can't do anything with, and it's a potentially difficult explanation and time consuming. So I don't want to go into it a lot, but yeah, there are all these nuances, but the FDA will in general work you over and make sure you test it in the right setting and population, especially now where it's prospective acquisition stuff, definitely for anything interventional. CT and MRI are a little bit different because everything's so standard, axial, and they'll actually let you use a retrospective database from a different hospital as part of your pivotal study. So it's a little different, I think.
Yeah, we had to, so for the lung acquisition data sets, we had to add a population of like expert physicians to use the AI because the thought is if someone is going to use it in sort of once it's out, then you kind of have to have the population represented in the operators, for instance. So that came like up for the study the pivotal study for lung acquisition. And that was based on FDA discussions. So they recommended that. And they have
Yeah, I guess
very,
what I'm
very
trying to say
interesting
is
ways of
you
phrasing
have to
those
declare it.
recommendations.
You have to declare it, but it's completely unenforceable once it's on a machine.
Right.
Yes.
You can have an IFU to cover your ass, but
Yeah.
This
The other
is
thing,
another great topic that I think we could go into a lot more detail on. We're running up on about 5 minutes left, and I have a couple questions that I want to cover really briefly before we wrap up. One is from the chat and asking if there are guidelines for reimbursement for our time in working on developing these data sets and research so that we are not undervaluing our time. How do y'all value your time or justify your worth to those that you're working for, either in the industry or the academic field?
I'll take this one because I have attempted more than once. It seems like this is a collaboration with the industry question in terms of developing a model. I have attempted more than once, and I think Mike has been a part of one of those discussions as well in the past, in terms of sharing our data and helping to develop a model with our input as well. And it just doesn't work out. The reason being, we are giving our valuable data, our input as a clinician, as well as a sonologist, but the company wants to own the model 100%. As you know, all of us who are working in academic institutions, we are employees of the institution. Our invention is their invention. So universities never will approve that. They want some sort of formula, and the companies are not willing to do that. So I gave up and I became a consultant instead. So you can charge your hourly rate for consulting, but I would be very hesitant to say that you share the data with them and then they somehow they will give you a fair share of the model developed. I haven't come across that. Yeah.
I will say some institutions will take that a little bit easier. I mean, I don't know how easy, it's months of sort of back and forth, but um, there had like Yale has gone through contracts like that, actually.
Yeah, and I'll say that working with not with industry, so working with other academic partners, that intellectual property piece is really important to figure out early. And I've definitely had to work with our legal team in the past to be able to divide that up. But then you, as the individual physician, your portion of the intellectual property is usually already set within like your contract at your university. So other places I work, you might own like 30% or get 30% of whatever it is, and certain part might go to the medical school, and then a certain part might come back to your department. So those things are already set and either need to be renegotiated or follow whatever your institution agrees with. And the other thing is that as you might be going towards, and to circle back earlier about some of the federal approvals, your institution, if it's large enough, may also have like a division directly like responsible for helping clinician investigators be able to go through the FDA and meet those requirements.
Yeah, I'd say at a minimum, it's really tough to claim ownership of an algorithm, right? Like, especially if you're working with an industry partner where the technical team is employed by the industry partner. But at a minimum, get your institution to maintain rights to the data set, I think is really important. You can't give away these data sets for free for many reasons.
And then
Thank you,
in terms of
everyone.
like, sorry, I'm going to add one more
Uh,
thing.
yeah,
In
please,
terms of
please.
like what you're getting out of it, like there's time that they can pay for you so that you work less shifts so that you can do the work stuff. There's opportunities to get involved in the writing process and put out papers, which for academia, like that is also a form of, if you will, reimbursement for us. And so there's sort of different, I don't think there's like either, there's definitely no guidelines and there's not like a one way sort of formula. I think we sort of each have done this differently and would do this differently depending on like the project and whether it's industry or academic partnership and kind of what the details of the project would be.
The other thing I'll add that's really important, and you may not think of about at the time, but if you end up signing any NDAs to work with industry and how that may affect your long-term capability to do additional work in that space. So I'd be really careful about that. And again, your university usually has a legal team that can review and also is oftentimes responsible for signing the NDA for you. So don't sign one of those independently unless you really know what you're doing. Otherwise, you might regret it down the road.
That is a great point. Thank you. I am going to close us with one final question, and then I'll make some announcements going forward. Dr. Schnick, you mentioned that there need to be more of us thinking about these problems with validation and in development of these data sets and tools. For clinicians, fellows, residents who want to get more involved in the space, either algorithm design or clinical integration, where would you all recommend that they begin? Who should they contact? Other than, of course, ACEP's AI and Emerging Tech and Ultrasound Research subcommittees. Do you have any advice for folks who are entering the space and want to get involved and be one of those people that you mentioned, Dr. Schnittke, thinking about these problems? And it's okay if the answer is ACEP's Emerging Tech and AI and Emergency Ultrasound Research subcommittees.
I think knowing people who are engaged in the space, which is, the people on this call, but there might be someone at your institution, even like in radiology, who's doing stuff. Um, there is a rite of passage of doing image annotation, but I do think it teaches you a lot about how this whole process works. And there's parts of it where I thought, wow, that's kind of cool. It's kind of like teaching a med student, and part of it was like, oh, this is what we're doing. This is like it's going to be tough to incorporate into a clinical environment. But I think you learn a ton, and then you start having an opinion, and then you finish your ultrasound fellowship, and suddenly you're the expert. Like you're top 0.5% of people who understand point care ultrasound in the world. So 0.1%.
I didn't want to say start with annotations, Nikolai, but I think that really is where a lot of us start, right? Like that it's such scut work, but it is what it is. And you start to just pick up pieces of information about the process and about the types of tools. And honestly, it develops your network. And I really think like most of academia, it's about your network. I find that going outside of emergency medicine, often there's a lot of people in your institution. If you don't see somebody locally, like in your department, there's often, an engineering team. There's often, radiologists, like you said, that are doing some of the work you're doing. Look outside your immediate space and develop kind of a multifaceted, multidisciplinary network, and it can you can be surprised what you come across.
Just a one high level message. Industry is developing technology because they have access to all the tools, and they're trying to fit whatever they developed into the clinical environment, and that's not just working. So my advice would be stop building AI models because you can, because you have access to technology and the data sets. Build it because it closes a real clinical gap and proves impact. And I think uh, I transitioned to that model as opposed to I have access to this, let me build something.
Thank you all for your perspectives on that. I know that there are a lot of people in attendance today that are going to hopefully take that advice to heart and join you all in this space. In closing, I want to thank all of our panelists so much for being here. We have a wonderful group who are immensely talented and accomplished. And thank you to you all, as well as Dr. Rapolo, Dr. Ferry, and Kevin Tamosidis for helping run and organize this event. We will have part 2 on March 18th. Time is yet to be determined, so please look out in email through ACEP's list server. There will also be a newsletter put together to summarize today's webinar. Additionally, ACEP's research subcommittee does have a meeting on February 18th at noon Central Standard Time. Dr. Rapolo has put a link to register in the chat. If anybody has any additional words of wisdom they want to share, fantastic. But thank you so much for your time. Thank you to our attendees, and everybody have a wonderful weekend.
So much.
Amazing job. This was awesome. Thank you all. Enjoy the rest of your day. Awesome job, Ryan.
Thank you, ma'am.
Bye, everybody. Thank you, Kevin. This is great. Appreciate you.